it's crazy now. Am I on, Dad? 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 You hear me, Dad? I said, do you hear me, Dad? Okay. So make sure you hear me, Dad. Okay, so it's about time to start class. Class could potentially be shorter than normal or not. We'll find out here. We are only going to cover one chapter today, and that's Genesis 38. We have lots of weeks left to cover the remaining chapters, so we're just going to focus on the first chapter, Genesis 38. Any particular questions that you have from your reading on Genesis 38? What's a shrine prostitute? Oh. Yeah, but a shrine prostitute is different here. Prostitute. Prostitute. Okay. You want to realize that in ancient times, your service to your God almost always involves sex. The reason it involves sex is because sex is a visible sign of fertility, and you would have what they would call today sympathetic magic, that if we can have fertility in this woman, then we can have fertility in this land. If we can have fertility in this land, then we can have fertility in this woman. So they were tied together in a lot of ways. And so one of the ways in which you would worship your God and ensure your crops or your animals or whatever part of your life needed growth, one of the ways you would do that is you would sleep with a temple prostitute. You would make your offering to that god or goddess or whatever here, and that would help ensure that your land or your animals or your own wife, family, would be fruitful and multiply here. So you do see this idea of a shrine prostitute, a temple prostitute, all the way up into New Testament times. It became less prevalent during the time of Jesus, and it just sort of mostly died off because even in the time of Jesus, while there were plenty of temples and plenty of false gods, there weren't as many true believers in the gods as there were centuries before that. So once the Greek Empire had conquered the world and then the Roman Empire took them over, their ideas about the gods and goddesses and what was reality had started to permeate the whole world. And so people still believed in gods, but not to the same degree that people in this time period would have believed. So you have somebody that would sleep with somebody to ensure that their family or their land or whatever would be fruitful and multiply. So that would be a shrine prostitute. Other questions from 38?
Was there an actual building or a...
You know, in Genesis 38, there wasn't.
There what?
There was not. You know, we do see that in this time period, what was considered holy were particular areas that were usually in the high hills. So the high places is what you see the Old Testament referring to. Any place that was higher up was by default closer to the God's realm, and that was considered more holy. So usually shrines were located on hills and built somewhere like that. But in this case, there wasn't anything to indicate it was except that her dress. Yes, sir?
Those veils must have been pretty heavy, like burlap, that he wouldn't even recognize his daughter-in-law.
Well, that's a possibility. So it could have been that it was so thick that he wouldn't recognize his daughter-in-law, but it could also be that he just had very little to do with her, and you know, he just didn't pay attention to what she looked like. You know, because again, you married your son to people, you're not concerned about what they look like, you were concerned about the relationships they would bring with you. Michelle? Okay, yeah, so it could go either way, be thickness, or he just wasn't observant at all. Michelle? Oh. No.
Later, when she's back home.
Yeah. And it's not her, it's them. He recognizes the staff and signet and all that sort of stuff. So it has nothing to do with her. Yes? Well, so the staff and the seal and the cord, those are all like his IDs, driver's license, credit card. So he just gave it to her because he wanted to prove that he was a good guy and he'd come back and pay her for his act. So it is definitely filled with a great deal of irony that a man engaged in unrighteousness from start to finish, that his one righteous act is involved in doing something sinful. It's like, oh no, I'll pay you. I'm good for the money. Here you go. And he leaves that stuff for her. Other questions? Yes, sir. Uh-huh. Well, let's talk about that here. So, what was the sin of and then Onan? So, if you look at the start, it says in verse 1, and it came about at that time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. Judah saw there was a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he took her and went into her. So she conceived and bore a son, and he named him Then she conceived again and bore a son and named him Onan. She bore still another son and named him Shelah, and it was at Chezbeth that she bore him. Now Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord took his life. Then Judah said to Onan, go into your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring for your brother. Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so when he went into his brother's wife, he wasted his seed on the ground in order not to give offspring to his brother. But what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, so he took his life also. So we'll stop there. So what was, in your understanding, reading, the issue that had done that caused God to kill him? So we do have Judah sleeping with his daughter-in-law, so incest. God doesn't kill him for that. We do have Jacob stealing birthright and blessing, and God doesn't kill him for that. We do have a great deal of wickedness up to this point, and the only time God is noted as killing anybody is during the flood. This is the first person God is said to have taken this person's life because of his wickedness. So, what do you suppose was his wickedness? Oh, Dad, I'm sorry.
He's acting like he's obeying, but then he finds a way to sneak out of it. He's trying to be a hypocrite. He's trying to say, I'm obeying you, but no, I'm not.
That's You're talking about or on.
Well, and On. I'm talking about both of them here. But I want to know about but we really should pay attention to Onan because that would help us. Did I see a hand? Okay. Well, we do see that. So you want to see that Judah takes a wife for his firstborn, Her name is Tamar. He's wicked. God kills him. So then Judah tells his secondborn, Onan, that because you're the brother-in-law, you need to go sleep with her so she'll have a child. She needs to have a child. And Onan does not want to do that because he knows whatever child she has will not be his, but will be hers. And so he makes sure that the Latin term was coitus interruptus. So he makes sure that he does everything to make sure she does not get pregnant at all. He still sleeps with her, still has sex with her, but make sure she doesn't get pregnant. Now, he does this because if Tamar has a child, well, that child will receive Er's inheritance. But if Tamar does not have a child, well, Er's inheritance rolls into Onan. So now he'll get a lot more of the goods. It is funny that no matter whether we're doing cash, gold, diamonds, or sheep and goats, everybody still wants more of what somebody else has. And we're just a bunch of greedy sort of people here. Let me ask you a different question. Why do we have chapter 38? If you looked at the end of 37, it says in verse 36, so in chapter 37 and verse 36, meanwhile, the Midianites sold him, Joseph, in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, and the captain of the bodyguard. And then if you just skip over to chapter 39 and verse 1, it says, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian official of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. It just seems to roll into the same story. But then we have chapter 38 just stuck right in the middle. So why do we have 38? Okay. So I do want you to see about the line. But the line of whom? Okay, so you want to see the line of Messiah, and that's big picture for us. But it's the line of Judah that's important for them, which comes into David. So you want to remember that when Moses is writing chapter 38, the Israelites have come out of bondage. They're getting ready to go into the promised land. And they're hearing these stories. They may have known about them. They may not have known about them. So they understand Reuben. He's no longer going to get the inheritance because he slept with his father's concubine. So he's excluded. And it makes sense why Simeon and Levi are excluded from the inheritance because, of course, they tricked an entire town, forced all the guys to get circumcised, and then murdered every one of them, and then took all the women and the children and said, you now belong to us. But Judah, you want to see that Judah, he's the fourth born, and they know that Judah's the important one. But what did we just read about Judah? Well, Judah's the one that said, well, you know what we should do is we should make a buck off our brother. So let's just sell him as a slave. And Reuben had tried to minimize it. Let's just throw him into a pit because, again, they were all going to kill him, Judah included. And Reuben was going to come back and get him, but Judah persuaded his brothers, let's not do that. Let's make some money. And so they sold Joseph. So when you get to 38, if you're an Israelite hearing the story for the first time, you're like, well, how is it that Judah's the all-important one? Because 37 ended with him being scum of the earth. You do want to remember that family is everything. And to betray your family, that's a horrible thing. They have all this infighting going on amongst themselves, which is bad enough, but to do something to your own flesh and blood, that's horrible. In the ancient world, the most important relationship you would have, the strongest relationship you have, was not husband and wife. The strongest relationship in the ancient world was brother and sister, brother and brother, siblings. Those were the foundational relationships that people always had. Husbands and wives can come and go, but your brother was your brother for your whole life, and you would take care of them and do things for your family. Your parents, not so much. Your children, not so much. But your siblings, that was the most important thing. So to read that Judah had done horrible things to Joseph, well, why is it that he's the number one tribe now that we've come out of captivity? Yes, sir.
I think in the life of Judah, we see a real transformation there. He starts out as the instigator, the leader of things that are bad. At the end, he's the one who's the leader who's trying to make things right with Joseph and with his dad and everything. That's my take on it.
Well, you do see a transformation. And this is the chapter that transforms him. This is why we have this chapter, to show that Judah is no longer the one, and from 37, but in 41 and on, he's the one who's willing to stand up and make better suggestions to his brothers. His brothers do listen to him. He's the one who's willing to intercede with his father and say, no, I'll be the payment, I'll be the risk, I will take all the danger on me when we give up Benjamin. He's the one willing to do all these things as a leader. But all that changes in chapter 38. And that's what we want to see, is that Judah goes from being excluded from the blessing to being receiving the blessing at the end because of what takes place here. So, when you look at the sin of and Onan, the problem is that Onan did not want to continue Judah's line. Even though he had selfish reasons for it, because he was just focused on the money, in God's point of view, that's not acceptable. Because I've said that Judah's the one who's going to bring forth Messiah, so his line will persevere. So Onan is killed just like that when he's not doing that, which is probably exactly what was doing. Was not using his wife to have a child. He was just using his wife to have sex. He was not about bringing forth a child for whatever reason. And you want to see that God considers that wicked. I was telling my daughter yesterday that we have a tendency to not realize that with the advent of the birth control pill in the 60s, the widespread use of that one of the consequences of that was the separation of the act of sex from procreation. And they became two separate things entirely, and people now have discussions today, well, I want to have a child, and we go this way. Well, I want to have sex, we go this way, and they're just night and day. But that's never what God wanted. God always intended that sex and procreation go together, and this is part of what takes place. It's not to say that every act of sex was for procreation, because it's not, but it is to say that procreation is part of sex, sex is part of procreation. When you think back to the very beginning of Genesis, what God told people is be fruitful and multiply. And then we have Adam and Eve, one man, one woman, one flesh, and so we're going to be fruitful, multiply. Judah here is not doing that, his sons are not doing that. And that's not what God finds acceptable. In our lives, we have now separated things out so much that we have taken our bodies and compartmentalized every aspect, and we don't realize that we are a totality. I hear Christians all the time, I've said it myself, I wish I could give up eating. You know, food, I just hate food. I wish I could stop lusting. I can't tell you how discouraged I was as a young man when I talked with an elder who was in his 70s about lust, saying, so, when's it go away? And he said, it doesn't. I'm like, that is not what I wanted to hear. I wanted to know that if I could just make it to here, I could coast and be good. But he's like, no, it doesn't go away. All he said was that your pool of available pretty ladies, it just grows way out there. You know, when you're 20, then you only think these people are pretty, but when you get older, it just grows and grows and grows and grows. So I didn't want to hear that because I just wanted to be able to say, I've conquered lust and I've gotten rid of this. What God wants us to realize is that I've given you a body and it's in totality and you've got to submit it to me all together and I will work with you about food, about work, about play, about sex, about everything. We are this body, which is why you have so many people in our society who disparage the body and think it's just horrible, it's broken down, it's junk, it's this, it's that, and they look forward to being some sort of afterlife that has nothing to do with the body because the body is everything bad. But the body is what God made us to have. This is why Jesus, when he was born in a body. And he grew up in a body. And he learned in a body. And when he died in a body. When he was buried in a body. And on the third day, when he was raised up in a body. This is what God meant for us. So, and Onan are threatening the line, which is why God gets rid of them. So then, Tamar wants to know about the third son, Shelah. And Judah's like, well, my first son died because of you. My second son died because of you. So we're just going to wait on that third son. We're just going to wait a little bit here. I do want you to realize that this whole chapter covers about 22 years. So we're talking stuff super fast. That as soon as Judah leaves his family, he marries somebody, gets her pregnant, and boom, 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 3 sons. And then we're talking, maybe 17 or 18 for this one. And then however long God put up with it, I don't know, killed. And then Shelah is only going to be another year younger, most likely. So it's all really close, all really happening fast here. Because this is the amount of time, 22 years, that Joseph is in Egypt, getting everything ready for Jacob and the family to come down and start being saved here. So these guys die. Tamar wants the next child, and Judah says no. Tamar is obedient to her father-in-law. She goes back home to her father and has the widow's clothes on, so she has some measure of protection, which is to say people are not going to do things here. But she's caught in limbo because she can't get married because her father-in-law hasn't said something about the third son because she still has a relationship with him. And so she just can't really do anything about anything, which is why she's just waiting there for Shelah to get old enough to be able to get her pregnant to carry on the line. This is why Genesis 38 ends with the birth of the twins. Who are the twins? Perez and somebody. The twins, those are the people that eventually give birth to David here. And that's why it ends with the birth of those twins. Because David's line, Judah's line needs to continue, so we have David, and then eventually we're going to have the Messiah. What we don't oftentimes think about at the start of Genesis 38 is that Judah has now cut his ties with his family. He's left Jacob and his brothers. He's moved far enough away that he marries somebody from Canaan. So he marries the people that God absolutely said don't have anything to do with. And while it's not said that Tamar is a Canaanite, it is implied. So he not only marries a Canaanite himself, but he gives his son a Canaanite as a wife. And so that's so far removed from what God has tried to stress during the whole time of the family's existence for all the way back from Abraham. So he's done these horrible things, and when it comes time for him to give his thirdborn for his wife, he says no. And so Tamar takes matters into her own hand. So look back at verse 12. Now after a considerable time, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. So Judah's wife dies. And when the time of mourning was ended, Judah went up to his sheep shearers at Timah, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. It was told to Tamar, "Behold, your father-in-law is going to Timah to shear his sheep." So he removed her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself and sat on the gateway of Enon, which is on the road to Timah, for she saw that Shelah had grown up, and she had not been given to him as a wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, "Here now, let me come in to you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, "What will you give me that you may come into me?" He said, "Therefore, I will send you a young goat from the flock." She said, "Moreover, will you give a pledge until you send it?" He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" And she said, "Your seal and your cord and your staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and departed and removed her veil and put on her widow's garments. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. He asked the men of her place, saying, "Where is the temple prostitute who was by the road at Enon?" But they said, "There has been no temple prostitute here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I did not find her." And furthermore, the men of the place said, "There has been no temple prostitute here." Then Judah said, "Let her keep them, otherwise we'll become a laughingstock. After all, I sent this young goat, but you did not find her." Now it was about 3 months later that Judah was informed, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot, and behold, she is also with your child by harlotry." Then Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." It was while she was being brought out that she sent to her father, saying, "I am with child by the man to whom these things belong." And she said, "Please examine and see whose signet ring and cords and staff are these." Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah," and he did not have relations with her again. So, I want you to understand what's really going on there. Judah has not fulfilled his duty by his daughter-in-law and made sure that her first husband, has an heir to carry on his family line. Judah only has 3 sons. And if Tamar does not conceive, then there's a likelihood that his line is going to die out, which is just a horrible thing in the ancient world. When Tamar realizes that Judah is not going to give the lastborn to her, she takes matters in her own hands. When she finds out he's going to go a place far away, she dresses up as a prostitute to deceive her father. She deceives her father-in-law. They have sex. She gets pregnant, and she goes back home. And then when they find out she's pregnant, well, they want to burn her. Mosaic law only had burning in the case of a priest's daughter becoming a prostitute, or for various types of incest. Getting caught with incest, then you would be burned as well. I want you to pay attention to what she says exactly. She doesn't say, "Well, you're the guy that got me pregnant." She says, "I am with child," in verse 25, "by the man to whom these things belong. Please examine and see whose signet ring and cords and staff are these." I want you to go back to chapter 37, verse 31 of 37. "So they took Joseph's tunic and slaughtered a male goat and dipped the tunic in blood. They sent the vari-colored tunic and brought it to their father and said, 'We found this. Please examine it to see whether it is your son's tunic or not.' Then he examined it and said, 'It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces.'" It's exactly the same phraseology. And Moses puts it in there because he wants Judah to remember that what you said to your father is what's being said to you. And what happened to your father when he lost a son? Well, now you can relate because you're a father and you have lost a son. And when you were upset with your father about how these things happened, well, maybe you see things differently because now you're in the situation he's in. That question, statement, whose man these are, Judah finds out who he is. She could have just said, "You're the man." Because remember, you did this. But she says, "I want you to examine these to see whose man this is," because she needs Judah to realize who he is. And he is a man who wanted to thwart the will of God, even though God killed his first son, killed his second son, because these guys are trying to thwart the will of God. And you're doing the same thing, and it's only God's grace that you've been spared because I interceded on your behalf. So who is Judah? You want to see the answer Judah gives. The answer Judah gives is, you are more righteous than I am. He now understands who he is. He now understands that he should have done things different. He now understands that if his daughter-in-law had not done what she had done, then he might have died. Now let me ask you a question. Righteousness. Do we understand what righteousness is? Yeah, that's what we have a tendency to do here. It is important for us to realize that we are creatures of our culture. It's hard for us to realize that the way we were raised is the way we see things. And the stories we were exposed to, the TV shows we watched, these are the ideas that form who we are. Case in point, myself. My dad's left. No, I'm sorry, I see his head. I don't like to go out to restaurants. I just don't like to eat out. Even to this day, I don't like to eat out. I don't like to eat out because my father had a temper, and God, when we were lost, saw fit to make sure that every time that man went to a restaurant to order a meal, it came back wrong. Every single time. It just didn't matter what he ordered. It could have just been scrambled eggs, and they would always give it wrong. Could have just been wheat toast. Could have been toast. Could have been sausage. Could have been patties. It didn't matter what the man ordered. It just got wrong. Everybody else's order got right. His would get wrong. And he would try to keep his temper under control. Can I see the manager? And then they would just be smart alecky. Well, you know, it's just links. It's like patties. It's this, that, just some stupid thing. And it would just escalate up. And so then Mom, Melva, would be like, Chuck's getting ready to blow his temper, so she would shuffle us out. If it only happened one time, it'd be okay, but it happened dozens and dozens of times. So I don't like to eat out because of all those things. That's who I am. Yes. Our understanding of righteousness comes out of the fact that in the 15 and 1600s, the Catholic Church was all powerful, and they believed that you could buy righteousness, that you could buy forgiveness of sins. They were so horrible in how they did things. And lots of men and women had been rebelling against the Catholic Church for centuries, but when Martin Luther finally had enough, and he was studying Romans, and he saw how righteousness was different than what the Catholic Church was doing, he had enough. His teaching was that righteousness was doing the right thing, as Wade said, doing these right actions, but we're not saved by righteousness. We're not saved by our own righteousness because we can't do the right things. Only Christ can do the right things. And so in our culture, righteousness and doing the right things have been all tied together. But that's the western part of the world. In the eastern part of the world, righteousness is defined different. Righteousness is about fulfilling the demands of a relationship. And this is the worldview the Bible is written under. Righteousness isn't about right and wrong so much as about fulfilling the demands of a relationship. Now, I have a relationship with God, and God knows that I cannot do right things and wrong things. He knows sin has corrupted me. So he says, I will take care of that end of the things. I will send my son. He'll be a sacrifice for you. And now we're going to have this relationship restored. Because as Isaiah says, my sins have broken that relationship. So God's going to restore that relationship. God furthermore knows that I'm just a hopeless sinner. That the right things I want to do, I just don't do those. And the wrong things that I don't really want to do, those are things that I do all the time. So God says, not only am I going to forgive your sins, but I'm going to give you my Spirit to help change you. Remember what we said earlier in Genesis? God is slow. God's not in a rush to get me changed because God's infinite. He knows I'm going to be changed, and He's going to work His plan, and He's going to see things. But in my mind, God wants me to change right now. This is why when we become Christians, we're like, well, I thought as soon as I got baptized that I wouldn't lust anymore, that I wouldn't have a problem with that. Or I thought as soon as I got baptized that my language would change, or that my temper would just go away. And then it doesn't work that way. And then it doesn't work that way for a number of years. And then we still struggle with the same sins. We still struggle with our anger or lust or our language or whatever. And we don't see ourselves when we first become a Christian. We just see ourselves as we are now. And in my mind, I just haven't changed a whole lot. I still struggle with all the same sins I've ever struggled with before. And I think, well, why am I doing these things? God, however, is able to look at the totality of my life and say, well, you've been a Christian 30-odd years. You really have changed. And you're going to be a Christian another 30 years, and you're going to change. What I need you to focus on, Charles, is being in a right relationship with me. Focus on me. That's why Jesus says, focus on me. Look to me. Be like me. No matter how many times you fail, be like me. Focus on me, and I, God, will change you over time. When we're focused on just doing the right things, that doesn't make us a better Christian. It just makes us a more miserable Christian. When we're focused on trying to be a right relationship with God, well, He changes us, and things do get better. This is why it's so hard to have a marriage. Because you start out and you're like, okay, I just need to do A, B, C, and I'll have a great marriage. If I just say I'm always sorry, if I just always hold the door open, make sure to clean up my clothes, we'll have a great relationship. And that may work for a couple of years, but then your wife expects more. You're like, oh, okay, so now I got to learn a new set of rules. So once I get these rules done, you're like, okay, I got it down. And then it's like, no, I need more. I need more because women have a tendency to be more concerned about relationships. Men are more concerned about the process. Let me memorize the steps. I'll be good to go. Which is why we have a tendency to want to say, okay, right, wrong. This is right, this is wrong. Avoid this, do this, great. Relationships are just a lot of hard work because it's ever changing. And you've always got to be trying to be vulnerable, always got to be trying to reach out to the person. So in verse 25, when Judah says that Tamar has been more righteous than I have, what he is saying is that Tamar has fulfilled the demands of the relationship. Because Tamar knew she needed to have a child. She got that child. You want to see that this is the first confession of sin. When he says that she's been more righteous than I am, he's acknowledging his sin. And it's that verse, that statement, that forever changes Judah. And he no longer is the person that's only concerned about himself. He is now concerned about his brothers and his family. Verse 25 is the one that takes Judah and makes him the leader he needs to be where the Messiah is going to come from. So the Israelites who are reading this can say, oh, I can see why God picked Judah, because now he turns into that leader that I always wanted to have. Fulfilling the demands of the relationship. If you think about righteousness along these terms, it will clear up a lot of confusions we have. We still need to do the right things. So don't get me wrong. Lying is still a lie. Okay? But if we understand about the relationship, then we're not so afraid that God's going to send us straight to hell because we lied. Because that's not what God's about. He wants that relationship with us, and He's doing everything for us. And as long as we're trying to have a relationship with Him, it'll be good. He'll change us slowly. We have 22 years it took Judah to change. 22 years from marrying a Canaanitess, giving his son to a Canaanitess, watching first and second son, to finally sleeping with his daughter-in-law, to realizing, oh, I need to be different. An indication of his righteousness now is that last statement in verse 25. Verse 26. And he did not have relations with her again. So he didn't sleep with her again. It was wrong the first time. It'd be wrong after that. But she did the right thing. She got the heir. And now things are going to move on. Which is why the chapter ends by talking about the birth of the twins. And that these are the ones whom the Messiah is going to come from. So, that's what I wanted to say about chapter 38. Any questions? Yes, Michelle, if it's a good question. If it's a hard question, I'm out of time, coincidentally. Say again? Yes. Yes. Yeah, Zerah was the first one. Perez was the second one. But that ties up with the other set of twins in the Bible, with Jacob and Esau. So the firstborn didn't get the blessing. The secondborn did. And this is another indication. And this is why the Israelites who are coming into the promised land, they understand the blessing is going to Joseph because he's the one that has 2 tribes to his name. Judah, why is he going to have this blessing? Why is he going to, Judah, what do we say? Joseph gets the birthright, Judah gets the blessing. Why does Judah get the blessing? Because of 38, and he changes his confession of sin. It does show you how very powerful confession of sin is. And it can change us over time. Yes, ma'am? You're right, I don't like you. You'll need to talk to your husband when you get home. Oh, okay. So you want to see that the veil and the coverings would have been full body coverings. So he would only seen her eyes. Judah would only seen Tamar's eyes as she's pretending to be a prostitute. It wasn't. It must have been a slightly different set of veils. That's why it says she took off her widow's clothes and she put on some different clothes. So it doesn't say to us how her clothes were different, but it does say to us that whatever she was wearing indicated to Judah that she was a prostitute. And he just assumed that if she's a prostitute, she's tied to a temple, a shrine, because prostitutes just didn't roam around drumming up business. They were always tied to a place, and that was always tied to a goddess here. So she just had that. It does puzzle you as to why a person would have sex and then not see the person, because in our society, sex is all about the visual, and it's all about naked people, whereas it wasn't so much then. We do realize that his wife had just died. He just got done mourning her. He's like, okay, I've got a need. Here's a prostitute. We've done our hard work. I'll celebrate. And that's what goes on.
So how did, you got to wonder,
Oh, I don't know how she knew that he was going to approach her. It doesn't say whether he was the only one that approached her. It doesn't say anything like that at all. She definitely had her act together. When it talks about that Judah found out, there's every possibility that Tamar made sure he found out because that was part of her plan. You know, it's like, I need you to find out so you can go ahead and get this through you that who are you? Well, you're the person who tried to thwart the will of God, and you didn't give me the child. So I need to know who you are. And you're a person who was a sinner, but now you have confessed. Confessed. And the fact that you've confessed makes you different now. So, not as good as answer, but it's just too many unknowns. Other questions?
Maybe we have to allow the Lord to work in this too,
Sorry.
They seem to get together.
Oh, yes. I have no doubt. You don't see God mentioned in 38, but you see his hand going on here. Because 38, we'll see this next week, has a number of comparisons, points of contact with chapter 39 and the life of Joseph. And Joseph and Judah have a number of tandem points because we want to see a contrast between the way Judah lived his life and the way Joseph lives his life. Roddy? It is. And you do want to realize it's usually an automatic connection. It says, was evil, God killed him. Was wicked, God killed him. That we say, was wicked, God killed him, he went to hell. That's a distinct possibility, but it's not a guarantee at all. All that we really need to get from this is that was thwarting the will of God, and God took him out of play. So with the next piece we put in there, and then when Onan didn't do the right thing, he was taken out of play. And when Judah didn't do the right thing, well, he was going to be taken, but Tamar did the right thing. And so God's will is going to be accomplished even though things don't look that way, and even though it isn't the church people doing the will of God, it was a Canaanitess, had no exposure to God at all, who was doing the right thing. And who was ensuring that the Messiah would come, which is why that Tamar is mentioned in the genealogy of Christ in Matthew. You know, because she is so significant, because she did the right thing, because she fulfilled the demands of that relationship, because she was righteous and Judah wasn't. Yes, sir? You do want to remember that Satan thinks he's smart. And he is definitely smarter than us. But he's just a created being. And it's nothing compared to God. You know, and if you ever played the game of chess, the great thing about chess is it's all out in the open. There is no hidden anything. There's no, I'm going to bring out this nuclear weapon from behind this hill that you couldn't see, boom. It's like, no, you see all the pieces. Everything's out open. But the person who wins and the person who loses is because they're actually looking at the game. The other person just sees only a small thing and is distracted. And that's the way we are. We just see small bits of our life, and we're not making these connections that we need to make, which is why God gives us his story in the Bible so we can see these points of connection and make them to our life so we can realize that we can get better at fulfilling the demands of relationship. As we can grow in our relationship with our spouses, we grow in our relationship with God. As we grow in a relationship with God, we grow in our relationships with our neighbor, with friends, with strangers, and we understand how we can reach out to them more because God wants to save everybody. God is love. He wants to restore everybody's relationship to him. And if we can help people understand, it's not about you giving up these 26,000 sins. It's about you just humbling yourself and saying, I was wrong. I did sin. And then God will work through you. We already saw Jacob I mean, when you look at the life of Jacob, he's just not a nice person any way you slice it. And we have problems that happen for generations because the way he treated his wife and children that still go on in perpetuity practically here. And the best he could do was just have one prayer to God saying, God, help me out. Because he was humble. And that's what God talks about. I exalt the humble, and I humble the exalted. So if we can get that attitude and convey that to other people, we can increase the borders of the kingdom. Any other thoughts or questions? Okay, so go ahead and read 39, 40, and 41. We'll cover those 3 chapters next week.